This has been a week of horrific crashes, figuratively and literally. The news has described the DC crash on Wednesday as the worst U.S. plane crash in a generation, killing 67 people, everyone on board, both the helicopter and the plane that collided midair. And then just 2 days later, a small air ambulance plane crashed in our own city, again, killing all on board, as well as at least one person on the ground and injuring others. It is a time of grief amidst disasters and horrific accidents, brought closer and closer to home as we learn the stories of the people who have been lost. People seeking life-saving medical treatment, and ice skating champions, and people who are looking forward to upcoming weddings, people who died in service to their medical profession or to their military service, children. And every time we experience horrific accidents like this, are moments where it is right to pause and to honor the dead, and to hold our own loved ones closer as we face the fragility of these wild and precious lives that we share. And then our own news has lifted the stories of these people who lost their lives in catastrophic ways near to us this week. We know that there are so many others around the world whose stories we will never hear, and yet who are as closely tied to our own humanity as the person who sits closest to us in this moment. And so, as others have done, let's take a moment of silence to lift the memory of those whose lives have been lost this week, or whose lives were forever altered by the deadly accidents this week and other ways. Let's take a moment of silence together. It is a truth of existence that we are born and we live, and at some point all of us will die, although we never know when and how our own end will come. It is part of why we say every time we gather that we know that what we do with our lives matters. We are all born, we all live, and at some point we will all die, and we can't fully know what comes before or what will come after, but we know somehow in the deepest places of our being that what we do with the lives that we have while we're here matters. It matters that we use our lives to create more love, and it matters that we use our lives to create more beauty, and it matters that we use our lives to learn and grow, and it matters that we use our lives to create more justice. Each of us has a chance to make the world a better place through our living. And in this community, we dedicate our lives to that purpose. Today's service is called Draw the Circle Wide. It's a line from a song that our musicians will sing in a little bit, and they'll invite us to sing as well. Draw the circle wide, they will sing. Draw it wider still. Let this be our song. No one stands alone. We stand side by side. Draw the circle wide. Like most things, it's an imperfect song, right? It uses ableist language to assume that each of us can or choose to stand as a metaphor for our togetherness. And of course, I'm sure some of you will like it, and some of you won't like it. That's normal. The power of the song to me, though, is how it speaks to this choice that we have in our living. Each of us has the power to impact our own sphere of influence, the circles of our family and our friends and the communities that we're a part of, or maybe it's our schools or our workplaces or volunteer communities or professional fields. We have an impact in our sphere of influence. And in singing the song, we remind ourselves to draw those spheres wide, draw those circles wide, and then draw them wider still and wider still. Our Unitarian theological ancestor, William Ellery Channing, he was from the turn of the late 1700s and the early 1800s. He wrote these words. He said, "I am a living member of the great family of all souls, and I cannot improve myself or suffer myself without diffusing good and evil around me in ever-enlarging spheres. I belong to this family," he says. "I am bound to it by vital bonds." And he was a white, affluent, well-educated man alive over 200 years ago. He was imperfect, like we all are, like our songs are. But he spoke powerfully to our faith, that we are all interdependent as well, right? That we are members of this great family of all souls, and that every choice we make, every single choice in our lives that we make will ripple outwards from us, diffusing good or ill or some combination into our fellow souls out in the world, in ever-enlarging spheres. "I belong to this family," he wrote. "We belong to each other. We are bound together." Former member of our own congregation, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, went further to say, she says, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul." In other words, we belong to one another. We are independent. We are bound together. And not only our individuals' actions will ripple out from us for good or ill or some combination, but when we allow our society, when we allow ourselves as a group to collectively trample on those with the least power, we receive the curse of that evil not just in ever-enlarging spheres, but also in the center of our own souls. As a Black woman in the mid-1800s in this country, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper knew a good deal about the curse of societal oppression. Not only what oppression does to those whose backs are against the wall, but those who participate in the oppression. Those who, through their actions or their silence, through their intentional disenfranchisement of those who have less power than them, or their failure to examine the privileges they are granted just for having been born in a certain body. She said these words to the 11th National Women's Rights Convention in New York City in 1866. It was to a crowd of mostly white women with whom she was working to gain the right to vote for all women, but also who repeatedly dismissed her and dismissed the need to also work for the rights of Black Americans who had been freed from slavery just the year before, as well as the freed Blacks who had been there a long time, like herself. "Draw the circle wide," Channing and Harper said. "We are bound together, all of us, all souls. And what we do with our lives radiates out in ever-enlarging ripples, blessing or cursing those who find themselves in our wake. If we do not choose to use our lives for blessing, for good, our lives still create those ripples. They're happening no matter what. And not only will our choices to create ill cause harm to those around us, the seeds of that harm will also implant in our own souls." So our spiritual theme for this month is inclusion. The people who are reflecting on them in small group ministries, our children are reflecting on them in our Spirit Ed programming. We will be reflecting on this theme here in worship. And inclusion is not a word I particularly like. Do others of you feel like bleh with the word inclusion? It's like it's a good word, but it's also like a. And disability rights activist Russell Lehman articulated that, like, for me in a way that I found meaningful. But when he wrote, "The act of inviting often implies a subtle power dynamic, as if someone is granting permission to belong," right? So when we use inclusion in that kind of shallow way, it's like there's someone who has the power to grant you permission to belong, and you are granted permission. Oh, don't we all feel good about ourselves? So the word inclusion, when not used with great intention, can feel like that, can serve as a code word, not for the true meaning of this great family of all souls, each with equal power, but for the practice of one group who holds power to invite another group that does not hold power into the sphere, but only under the unspoken assumption that the powerless ones are only allowed into the powerful sphere as long as they act the way the powerful ones want them to act, as long as they do not make any real changes in their sphere. Lehman writes, inclusion isn't about being invited to sit at somebody else's table. It's about building a new table together, where each person's voice and presence matter equally. Or as Zen priest and author of Being Black, Zen and the Art of Living with Fearlessness and Grace, Angel Kyoto Williams Sensei writes, she writes, it's the community's job to figure out how we can stretch into the so-called margins and broaden our understanding of the ability to be inclusive. Inclusivity, she writes, is not how do we make you part of what we are. Inclusivity is how do we become more of what you are. So as we talk together about inclusion this month, in our worship services everywhere around church, we are going to be seeking to speak to this broader, deeper understanding of the word inclusion. In this community, that means doing the work of examining and dismantling the oppression that's threaded through the fabric of our ways of being together and our history. These threads of oppression which hinder us from building that new table together where everyone's voice and presence matter equally. It's not about becoming more diverse as a community in a shallow way. It's about casting a vision for a community that reflects that great family of all souls, instead of seeking to make all souls fit into some kind of unexamined cultural confines here. It's about working collectively to become a community that breaks through our own confines, to become genuinely a place of multiple ways of being. Inclusion is not an end goal here or anywhere. Justice is the end goal, right? But inclusion, in its deep sense, is about removing barriers. Sometimes they're visible barriers, sometimes they're invisible, that keep justice from being a possibility. And without removing those barriers, we will never embody true justice. And so, as much as I don't particularly like the word inclusion, obviously I just gave you a very long caveat about what inclusion means, because it's so often used in this shallow sense, rather than the deep sense. I am reminded these weeks that even in that shallow sense, even in that simple sense, the work of inclusion remains radically important. And I'm talking about the White House's work to decimate so-called DEI work. DEI, which stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, is the work that happens in all kinds of workplaces and schools and other institutions to remove barriers to opportunity and justice that keep some people out. And the attack on DEI, for those people who've been around the block with one attack after another on anti-oppression work over the years, it might just feel like this attack is just another way that we need to find a new way to do similar work, the way that the term DEI came into being in part because they did the same thing with affirmative action, right? In some ways, I trust that the people who are doing this good work are going to continue to find ways of doing it because we know it's essential in this world where there's a million barriers to justice and opportunity. But this time does seem worse to me because federal employees are now required to report any colleagues that they believe are furthering DEI efforts in disguise to their supervisors. Employees have received emails, some of you may have, I know a lot of you have federal employees, some of you may have received emails that others have received warning of, quote, adverse consequences if you fail to report any colleagues who are still carrying out DEI measures. We know this playbook from 1930s Germany, right? And we know that President Trump is already trying to use any emotionally devastating experience that we share in this country, not for unity, but to reinstall those barriers to opportunity and justice. I felt physically sickened when at Thursday's press conference, before there was any investigation, before there was anything known about what happened to cause that mid-air crash in DC between the plane and the helicopter, our president immediately blamed many people, but high on that list were the helicopter pilot, and then diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. He blamed the crash on the helicopter pilot without knowing anything about the crash and diversity, equity, inclusion policies. And what we know now that we didn't know then, but I suspected then, and maybe some of you did, and what I'm sure Trump knew then, was that the helicopter pilot was a woman. And her name was not initially released officially because early on her family requested that she not be named. And so I'm going to make some assumptions in the next things that I'm going to say, because there could be all kinds of reasons for that. But part of an anti-oppression practice is what's called like a ethic of suspicion, or a reading between the lines, because often things can't be spelled out. Oppression is not spelled out. You find oppression between the lines of what is spelled out. So there could be many reasons for why her family didn't want her named. But at least one that I immediately suspected was that they didn't want to see their beloved family member be publicly torn apart for the sin of being a woman in a man's job. A simple, not deeply researched Google search, I will admit, tells us that women make up only 5 or 6% of all pilots in this country. Maybe it's 8% of military pilots, meaning that somewhere between 92% and 95% of pilots in this country are men. But not her. And I don't know this with 100% certainty, but as far as I can tell from the way that the story has unfolded, with absolutely no information about the technical circumstances that caused the crash, knowing nothing about whether it was human error or mechanical failure or physical weather, or any of a million other reasons for such an incredibly devastating loss of life, Trump immediately blamed the helicopter pilot because, I think, she was a woman. The pilot, whose name has now been released, Rebecca Loebbach, has been spoken of by her family and by her colleagues as a bright star who was kind and generous and brilliant and funny and ambitious and strong, and a warrior who would not hesitate to defend her country in battle. But she was a woman in a man's job. And so without knowing anything else, the president publicly blamed her for the deaths of 67 people. So how many of you who are here on Zoom and in the sanctuary have been somebody like Rebecca Loebbach, been the first of something, or maybe you're the first Black manager in your company, or you're in a role that traditionally belonged to somebody who doesn't look like you? Raise your hand if you've been a first of some kind, or just an unusual of some kind. Yeah, lots of hands raised on Zoom. Lots of yes and me and I have on Zoom. When I'm here, I often forget that I'm a woman in a man's job, because it doesn't seem to be a problem here. But I will say that when I go to interfaith gatherings, I'm like, oh my God, right. Right, only 20% of clergy in this country are women, as I am surrounded by so many men in collars. And for those of us who weren't a first, those of us who didn't raise our hands just now, who haven't been in that role that traditionally belongs to a different kind of person, how many of us have still benefited from people who have been in those roles? How many of us have learned from, or been led by, or collaborated with, or been cared for by a woman in a man's job, or a queer person in a straight professional field, or a working class person in higher education? Has anyone not raised their hand? Our lives have all been made better by the expansion of opportunity and access of all people into fields and arenas that have only traditionally had one kind of person, whether we are those people or whether we have been benefited by those people. Even if the inclusion that opened up those fields and arenas was shallow and imperfect, even if we have scars from using our own heads to shatter those glass ceilings, we cannot let the work of expanding opportunity and dismantling barriers to justice to move backwards, no matter how much the White House will try to deputize us to try to take each other down. Because we are made safer by trans service members and women pilots, and our lives are made better by all of the immigrants in this country, regardless of whether they have documents. And ultimately, we know what the author of Black Liturgies, Cole Arthur Riley, writes to be true. She writes that exclusion operates by the same rule of mutuality as welcome. This is a lot of words. I'll repeat the parts that are maybe easier to hear. Exclusion operates by the same rule of mutuality as welcome, for it harms both the excluded and the excluder. If you are at the hands of exclusion for long enough, if you've been excluded for long enough, you learn acceptance only at the hands of someone else's exile. You learn belonging as competition, not a restoration of the whole. If you are at the hands of exclusion for long enough, you learn acceptance only at the hands of someone else's exile. You learn belonging as a competition, not as a restoration of our wholeness. Steph read these words: "To belong is to be longing for a space to be held and that will hold friend and stranger and neighbor and other, for silence is broken by songs of the silenced. For a time that does not stretch but encircles, to belong is to be longing for wholeness of the beloved of all who belong and all who are longing." My friends, we are living members of the great family of all souls, and what we do with our lives matters. We are bound together in one great bundle of humanity. As we go forth this week, may the ripples we create through each of our choices bring good to those in our wake. Amen. Blessed be.
Hi, I'm Reverend Abby Tennis, and I use she, her pronouns.
I'm Reverend Alexandre da Silva Soto, and my pronouns are they, them, and theirs.
And we are the ministers of the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, where it is our mission to awaken love and justice in our lives and in the world. We're so glad you watched this video, and we hope that its message connects with your soul.
We also want to invite you to join us for Zoom services Sunday morning at 11 a.m. or come in person at 2125 Chestnut Street, Center City, Philadelphia.
Whether you join in person or online, in these services you'll hear messages like you just heard. You'll get a chance to sing together, pray together, and even greet one another in coffee hour afterwards, whether you're brand new or a longtime member.
You can always find a Zoom link to our services and more about what to expect on Sunday mornings on our website, philauu.org. The link is below.
If you are connecting with this message and feel moved to give to the mission of this congregation, we invite you to click on the link below again and follow the prompts to give, or send a text message to 215-709-5095. And again, follow the prompts.
If someone in your life needs to hear these words today, please share this video. And again, thank you so much for watching.
We hope to see you soon.
See you soon.